I almost didn't go to that dinner party. 3 years of living alone had made me good at saying no to things like that. But my friends wouldn't stop pushing, and something I can't explain told me to put on a clean shirt and show up. They sat me next to a woman named Emma, and everyone at the table called her the quiet one. She didn't say much, and I almost dismissed her too. Then she asked me one question, and it cracked open a door I'd sealed shut for 3 years. My name is Henry, and I'm 52 years old. I live alone on a small farm about 20 minutes outside of town, the kind of place where the nearest neighbor is close enough to wave to, but far enough that you can go days without seeing another person if you don't want to. And for 3 years, I didn't want to. The farm isn't much, just 40 acres of hay and a few head of cattle, a barn that needs painting, and a 2-story house that's too big for one man, but too full of memory to leave. Eleanor and I built this place together over 23 years of marriage, piece by piece, from a stretch of land nobody wanted into something that felt like ours. She picked the color of the kitchen walls and the type of roses by the front porch, and I built the fence and fixed the roof when it leaked. Every corner of this property has her fingerprints on it. For a long time, that was the reason I couldn't leave, and the reason I couldn't stay. She died 3 years ago. Cancer, and it moved fast, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare even when the doctors tell you to start preparing. One spring, she was planting tomatoes in the garden, and by the first snow, she was in a hospital bed, looking at me like she wanted to say something she couldn't figure out how to say. I held her hand when she passed, and the house went quiet in a way I didn't know how to fill. After the funeral, I went back to work, because the cows don't care about grief, and the fence posts don't fix themselves. I fed the animals, checked the water, mended what needed mending. When the sun went down, I sat in the kitchen with a plate of food I didn't taste, and people brought casseroles for the first month, and I was grateful for every one of them. But eventually the deliveries stopped, and the silence settled into the house like something that had been waiting for its turn. I had a routine, and I clung to it the way a man in open water clings to a piece of driftwood. Every day was the same. I'd wake up at 5, feed the cows, check the fences, eat something simple, work until the light fades, and sit on the porch with Bo until the stars come out. Bo is a brown mutt I found behind the barn 4 years ago, and he's been my shadow ever since. The kind of dog who doesn't need words to understand that sometimes you just need someone sitting close. The two of us would sit there in the dark, and I'd talk to him about things I couldn't say to anyone else, about Eleanor and the empty chair and the way the house felt like it was holding its breath. My closest friends are Walt and Marie, a couple who've lived 3 miles down the road since before Eleanor got sick. Walt is the kind of man who shows up at your door with no warning and expects you to be glad about it, and Marie is the kind of woman who brings food and stays to watch you eat it. They'd been trying to get me out of the house for 2 years, inviting me to barbecues and church socials and football games, and I'd gotten good at saying no with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. I'd tell them I was fine, and they'd nod, and we'd all pretend that was the truth. But I wasn't fine. I was functioning, which is a different thing entirely, and most people can't tell the difference from the outside. Somewhere inside, the part of me that used to look forward to things had gone quiet, not dead, but dormant, like a field left fallow too long. The days blurred together, each one the same color as the one before, and I told myself that was peace, because peace sounds better than admitting you've stopped trying. The kitchen table still had 2 chairs, and I'd stopped moving the second one a year ago, because looking at it every morning made the grief feel fresh instead of familiar. And maybe it would have stayed that way. Maybe I would have kept my routine and my silence and my comfortable distance from the world if Walt hadn't called me on a Thursday and changed the direction of my life without asking permission. Walt doesn't believe in small talk. He called me on a Thursday afternoon, and before I could even say hello properly, he was already talking. "Henry, Saturday night, our place, 7 o'clock. Marie's making that chicken thing you like, and a few people are coming over. Nothing crazy." I could hear Marie correcting him in the background, something about it being a dinner party and not just a few people, and Walt waving her off the way he does when he thinks she's making something simple into something complicated. I told him I'd think about it, which is what I always say when I mean no. But Walt has known me for 30 years, and he's never once mistaken "I'll think about it" for anything other than what it is. "You're coming, Henry," he said. Not mean, just certain, the way someone talks when they've already made the decision for you and are just being polite about the announcement. "And there's someone I want you to meet." That got my attention, and not in a good way. I told him I wasn't doing that, and I could feel my shoulders tighten the way they do when someone pushes at a door I've already locked. He told me her name was Emma, that she was a friend of Marie's from work, and that she was nice, but a little quiet. The way he said "a little quiet" made it sound like an apology, like he was preparing me to be underwhelmed, and I almost laughed because at least he was honest about it. I asked him what she looked like, and he said blonde, pretty, maybe early 30s, and I told him that was exactly why I wasn't going. I don't know why I said that, because it wasn't the whole story. The whole story is that the idea of sitting across from a woman and making conversation felt like something I'd forgotten how to do, like a language I used to speak but had let go rusty from years of not using it. Eleanor was my language. She was the person I talked to about everything, the one who knew my silences and what they meant, and the thought of starting over with someone new felt less like an opportunity and more like an insult to what we had. But Walt wouldn't let it go, and Marie got on the phone and told me I was being stubborn. She said Emma was one of the kindest people she'd ever met, and that I didn't have to marry the woman, I just had to sit next to her for one evening. "You've been alone long enough, Henry," she said, and the gentleness in her voice was worse than Walt's bluntness, because it made the loneliness feel seen instead of hidden. I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a long time, with Beau lying by the back door watching me with that look he gets when he knows something is happening. On Friday night, I opened the closet to find a clean shirt, and the left side was still Eleanor's. Her dresses and her cardigans hang there like she'd just stepped out for the afternoon, and I hadn't touched them, hadn't moved them, hadn't even looked at them in months, because looking at them felt like opening a wound I'd spent years teaching myself to close. I grabbed a blue button-down from my side, pushed the closet door shut, and stood in the hallway, breathing harder than a man should breathe over a shirt. The drive to Walt and Marie's house took 20 minutes, and I spent every one of them rehearsing conversation topics in my head, like a kid preparing for a test he doesn't want to take. I told myself I'd stay an hour, maybe 2, and then I'd make an excuse about the animals and leave. I told myself I didn't have to talk to Emma if I didn't want to, that I could just sit through dinner and be polite and go home. But somewhere between my driveway and theirs, between the dark fields and the quiet road, something shifted in my chest that I couldn't name. It wasn't hope exactly, but more like the absence of the weight that says nothing good is going to happen. And that small absence was enough to keep me driving instead of turning around. Walt and Marie's house was warm and bright when I pulled up, the kind of warm that comes from too many people in a space built for 4. I could hear laughter through the front door before I even knocked, and for a moment I considered walking back to my truck and driving home. But Walt opened the door before I could decide, pulled me inside with a handshake that was really a hug, and without even realizing it, I was in the middle of a dinner party I hadn't wanted to attend. There were 7 other guests besides me, and the room was full of the kind of noise that comes from people who are comfortable with each other. A woman named Rachel was holding court near the kitchen, telling a story about a coworker that had everyone laughing, and she had the kind of presence that fills a room the way warm air fills a house. Another guest, a man named Doug, was arguing good-naturedly with Marie about the right way to season a chicken, and 2 couples I didn't know were already deep in conversation about someone's kitchen renovation. And then there was Emma. She was already seated at the dining table when I first noticed her, sitting at the far end with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes tracking the room the way someone watches a movie they're not part of. Blonde hair, simple burgundy dress, the kind of person who doesn't take up space in a room full of people who are happy to take up all of it. She smiled when Rachel's story hit its punchline, but she didn't add anything, didn't laugh out loud, didn't lean forward to make sure anyone noticed she was listening. Walt steered me toward the table and introduced us. Emma, this is Henry. Henry, Emma. I'll let you two get acquainted. He said it with that grin of his, the one that means he thinks he's being subtle, and then he disappeared back into the kitchen before I could object. Emma stood up to shake my hand, and I noticed two things right away. Her grip was firm, not the limp handshake you get from someone who's nervous, and her eyes were direct, looking straight at me like she was actually seeing me and not just performing the social motions of an introduction. Nice to meet you, Henry, she said, and that was it. 4 words, polite, simple, and then she sat back down and returned to watching the room. I sat next to her because the empty seat made it clear that was the plan, and I spent the next 15 minutes trying to figure out how to start a conversation with someone who didn't seem interested in having one. The contrast between Emma and the rest of the room was hard to miss because Rachel was loud and funny and made everyone feel like part of the show, while Emma sat through all of it calm and still, present but separate, watching but not performing. But there was something else, something I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been sitting right next to her. When someone told a joke and the room erupted, Emma's smile reached her eyes. When Doug made an offhand comment about his divorce, her gaze shifted to him for a moment with something that looked a lot more like understanding than pity. She wasn't checked out or bored or wishing she was somewhere else. She was paying attention to everything, just processing it on a frequency that didn't match the rest of the room. I filed that observation away, not knowing what to do with it yet. Marie called us to the table for dinner, and I took my seat next to Emma, still trying to figure out what Marie had seen in her that made her think we'd get along. Dinner was pot roast with root vegetables and fresh bread, the kind of meal Marie makes when she wants people to feel taken care of. I ended up seated next to Emma, which was clearly the plan all along, and the table conversation moved around us like water around 2 stones. Rachel launched into a story about her recent trip to the coast, and Doug jumped in with his own vacation disaster, and within minutes, the whole table was trading travel anecdotes like they'd been waiting for someone to give them permission. I tried small talk with Emma because it felt rude not to. I asked where she was from, and she said she'd grown up about an hour north, in a small town she didn't name, and that she'd moved down here for work a few years back. I asked what kind of work, and she said bookkeeping for a family-owned lumber company. I nodded, she nodded, and the conversation stalled like a truck in mud. I tried one more angle, asking if she liked the area, and she said yes, she liked the quiet, and then she picked up her fork and went back to her pot roast. I'll be honest with you, I was starting to think Walt had made a mistake. Emma wasn't cold or rude, but she didn't give me anything to work with, and I'm not the kind of man who can keep a conversation going by himself. I turned my attention back to the group, where Rachel was now telling a story about her neighbor's dog that had the whole table laughing, and I let myself get swept along with the current because it was easier. The loud people were entertaining, and I didn't have to work for it. About halfway through dinner, Rachel leaned across the table toward Emma with a grin that was meant to be affectionate. "You're awfully quiet tonight, Emma. The strong, silent type, huh?" A few people laughed, and Emma smiled along with them, but something in her eyes shifted, just for a second, like a door closing softly. Not hurt, not angry, just a quiet withdrawal, the kind of move someone makes when they've heard that joke before and know it isn't worth responding to. I caught it because I was sitting close enough to see, and it stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. Then something happened that changed the direction of the whole evening, though I didn't know it at the time. Doug mentioned a friend of his who'd recently lost his father, and the table got quiet for a moment, the way it does when someone introduces something real into a room that's been running on surface energy. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the one that shows up whenever loss gets mentioned, because grief has a radar that never turns off. I looked down at my plate and gripped my fork a little harder, waiting for the moment to pass. And in that half second, I felt someone watching me. Not the way Rachel watches people, looking for material for her next story, but something different, something steady and careful that felt like being read instead of being observed. I looked up and caught Emma's eyes on me, and for a moment, just a breath, she held my gaze. There was no pity in her expression, no curiosity, no performance of concern, but something else entirely that I recognized on a level below words. It was the way you recognize a song you heard as a child but can't remember the title of, and it lodged inside me like a splinter working its way under the surface. She looked away before I could figure out what to do with it, returning to her plate like nothing had happened. But the moment wouldn't leave me, even as the conversation moved on and the laughter picked back up and the table returned to its comfortable noise. Something had passed between us, and I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew it mattered. Marie brought out dessert around 9, a peach cobbler that smelled like summer, and the table shifted into that comfortable post-dinner rhythm where conversations break into smaller clusters and people lean back in their chairs. Rachel was showing photos on her phone to the couple beside her. Doug was pouring a second glass of wine, and the energy in the room had softened into something warm and loose. I was reaching for my coffee when Emma set down her fork. She didn't slam it or make a show of it, just placed it gently on the edge of her plate and turned to face me. There was something deliberate in the movement, like she'd been waiting for the right beat in the conversation, the right gap in the noise, and now she'd found it. She looked at me with those direct eyes, the same ones that had caught me during the moment about loss, and she spoke in a voice quiet enough that only I could hear it over the table's chatter. How long has it been since someone actually asked you how you're doing, and you told them the truth? The question landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. The noise of the party pulled back, not literally, but in the way perception works when something cuts through the surface, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing. She stared back at me, patient, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world and no expectation of what I'd say next. It wasn't a clever question. It wasn't witty or charming or designed to impress, but the kind of question that goes straight past every wall because it isn't aimed at the wall at all. It was aimed at the exact thing behind it, the thing I'd been hiding so long I forgot it was visible. And the part that made my throat tighten was that she already knew the answer. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't asking because she didn't know. She was asking because she wanted me to say it out loud. I tried to laugh it off. "I'm doing fine," I said, and the words tasted like cardboard in my mouth, flat and hollow and unconvincing even to my own ears. Emma didn't push, didn't press or follow up or try to pry the answer loose. She just nodded, once, slowly, with an expression that said she'd expected exactly that answer and wasn't going anywhere. Then she returned to her cobbler like the question had been nothing more than a passing comment about the weather. But it wasn't nothing. I knew it, and from the look in her eyes when she nodded, she knew I knew. The rest of the party continued around us, Rachel laughing, Doug pouring wine, Marie collecting plates, and I sat there with my coffee going cold in my hands, somewhere far from that dining room. I was inside myself, looking at a door I'd sealed shut 3 years ago, a door I'd covered with rust and silence and the comfortable story that I was fine. Someone had just slipped a key under it, not forced it open or knocked it down, but without warning or drama, slid a small brass key underneath and walked away. And I didn't know what to do with that key, whether I wanted to use it or push it back or pretend I hadn't seen it, but I knew I couldn't unsee it. The woman sitting next to me, the one everyone had called quiet, had seen something in me that I'd spent 3 years making sure nobody else could see. The party started to wind down around 10. People found their coats, exchanged hugs, made promises to get together soon that everyone knew were mostly polite fiction. I should have left with the first wave, should have grabbed my jacket and made an excuse about early mornings and cattle that needed feeding, but my feet wouldn't carry me to the door. That question was still sitting in my chest like a coal that wouldn't cool, and I couldn't leave without knowing why she'd asked it. I found Emma on the back porch, alone, standing at the railing and looking out at the dark yard. The night air was cool and smelled like Marie's garden, something herbal, rosemary maybe, and the crickets were loud in the way they get when you step outside after hours inside. She didn't turn around when I opened the screen door, but she didn't look surprised either, like she'd been waiting to see if I'd come. I stood next to her at the railing, and we were quiet for a while. The kind of quiet that feels different from the quiet I'd been living in. My quiet had been empty, a room with no one in it, but this quiet was full, like the moment before someone says something that matters. "Why did you ask me that?" I said, and it came out rougher than I meant, more raw, but she didn't flinch. She turned her head to look at me, and in the dim light from the kitchen window, her expression was calm and open, and completely without pretense. "Because you looked like someone who hadn't been asked in a long time," she said, "and because I know what that looks like." I asked her what she meant, and she told me. Not all at once, not in a rush, but in pieces, the way you share something personal when you've decided someone is worth sharing it with. She'd lost her mother when she was 19, in a car accident on a Tuesday afternoon that turned a normal day into the day everything split into before and after. Her father had handled it by going silent, not cold, but hollow, a man who kept functioning but stopped living, and Emma had spent years watching him disappear into himself without knowing how to reach him. "I learned something from watching my dad," she said, and her voice was steady but soft, like she was reading from a page she'd memorized long ago. "I learned that most people don't actually listen. They wait for their turn to talk. They ask how you're doing, and they expect, 'Fine,' and if you say anything else, they don't know what to do with it. So I stopped talking unless I had something to say, and I started watching people instead, because watching tells you more than talking ever does." Something rearranged itself inside my understanding as I stood there on that porch. The quietness that everyone at the table had dismissed as boring, the silence that Rachel had joked about, the stillness that I'd almost mistaken for emptiness, none of it was what it looked like. It was patience and attention, a woman who had learned that most people don't listen, so she'd taught herself to see instead, and she'd gotten so good at it that she could read a stranger's grief in the half-second it took him to look down at his plate. Emma wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she was full, and she'd learned to be careful about who she let see it. And somehow, across a crowded dinner table, she'd decided I was worth seeing. I don't know how long we stood on that porch before I started talking about Eleanor. It wasn't planned, wasn't something I decided to do in any conscious way, but something Emma had loosened in me earlier was still open, and the words started coming before I could decide whether to let them. I told her about meeting Eleanor at a feed store when I was 27, how she'd been arguing with the clerk about the quality of their tomato seeds, and I'd been so captivated by the intensity of it that I'd offered her a ride home. I told her about the farm, how Eleanor and I had built it together from nothing, how she'd been the one with the vision, and I'd been the one with the hands, and how together we'd made something neither of us could have made alone. I told her about the cancer, the speed of it, the way a year that started with planting tomatoes ended with hospital rooms and morphine, and the slow dimming of the brightest person I'd ever known. The words came out in a flood I hadn't expected, like a dam that had been holding for 3 years and finally found a crack. And then I told her the part I'd never said out loud to anyone, not to Walt, not to Marie, not to the counselor Marie had dragged me to for 2 sessions before I stopped going. I told her about the guilt, the feeling that crept in after the funeral and never left. The quiet voice that said wanting anything again was a betrayal, like laughing at a joke or enjoying a meal or standing on a porch with a woman I'd just met was somehow a violation of what Eleanor and I had. Like grief was a debt I owed, and the only way to pay it was to stop living. Emma listened, not the polite listening of the dinner table, not the sympathetic listening of friends who mean well but don't know what to do with your pain, but something deeper. She listened the way a river listens to rain, absorbing everything without resistance, present and steady, and patient enough to hold whatever came. She didn't interrupt, didn't nod at the wrong moments, didn't offer reassurances that would have rolled off me. She just stood there and received it. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like someone was actually hearing me. When I finished, the porch was quiet except for the crickets, and my hands were shaking slightly, the way they do when you've held something tight for too long and finally let go. Emma was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark yard, and then she said something I've carried with me every day since. She wouldn't want you to stop living just because she had to. It wasn't a platitude. I've heard plenty of those over the last 3 years, the well-meaning phrases that people reach for when they don't know what else to say, and I've learned to nod and smile and let them slide off. But this was different because of who was saying it. A woman who had watched her own father stop living after losing her mother, who knew from the inside what that kind of grief does to a person. She wasn't offering comfort, she was offering truth, the kind that only lands because the person speaking it has earned the right through their own pain. Something broke loose in my chest when she said it. Not grief, not relief, but something unnamed that had been stuck for 3 years, like a knot in a rope that finally worked itself free. I looked at Emma, and for the first time that evening, I didn't see the quiet woman from the dinner table. I saw someone who had understood me in one night better than my friends had in 3 years. Someone who had looked past the functioning exterior and found the man underneath who'd stopped letting himself feel. I should have stayed on that porch. I should have let the conversation keep going, let whatever was forming between us take the shape it was trying to take. But I didn't, because the thing that was forming was terrifying, and the man I'd been for 3 years didn't know how to stay in a moment that real without reaching for the exit. I stood up from the railing, and my voice came out steadier than my hands. "It's getting late," I said, and the words came out flat and final, a deliberate shutdown, because what I was feeling had gotten too real to sit with. I thanked her for the conversation, said it the way you say thank you to a cashier, polite and hollow. And I watched something shift in Emma's expression, a small receding, like a tide pulling back from shore. I went inside and found Walt in the kitchen, helped him clear a few plates I didn't need to clear, and told him I had an early morning. He gave me a look that said he knew exactly what I was doing, but he didn't push. "Drive safe, Henry," he said, and I nodded without meeting his eyes, because meeting his eyes would have meant acknowledging what he already knew. I didn't look back at Emma as I left. I walked through the living room, grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door, and stepped out into the night, and the screen door closed behind me with a soft clap that sounded louder than it should have. The drive home was 20 minutes of silence and white knuckles. I gripped the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing in a world that had started shifting under me, and I tried to put the feeling back in the box I'd built for grief and guilt and everything that didn't fit into my routine. But the box wouldn't close, because what Emma had uncovered in me wasn't going back underground, and no amount of driving or gripping or telling myself it was just a conversation could make it disappear. I told myself I was reading too much into it. She asked a good question, I gave an honest answer, that's all it was. And I was vulnerable because it had been 3 years since anyone had asked me something real. Anyone who said the right thing would have gotten through. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything. Because if it meant something, then I'd have to acknowledge that something in me was still alive, still capable of connection, still able to feel something beyond the dull routine I'd wrapped around myself like a bandage. But I knew that wasn't true. The way you know a storm is coming before the clouds gather, the way your body knows things your mind hasn't caught up with yet. I'd had 3 years of people saying the right things. It gets easier, and she'd want you to be happy, and you should get out more, and none of it had touched me. Emma's question had gone through all of it like it was made of paper, and the reason I ran wasn't that she wasn't enough. The reason I ran was that she was. I got home to a dark house and a dog who needed letting out, and I stood on my porch in the same spot I stand every night, looking at the same stars, breathing the same air. But everything felt different, because the silence wasn't comfortable anymore. It was loud, and it was full of a question I couldn't stop hearing, asked by a woman I'd known for 3 hours, who had seen me more clearly than anyone I'd known for 30 years. The next 3 days felt like trying to wear a coat that no longer fit. I went through my routine, because the routine is what keeps me upright, feeding the cows, checking the fences, drinking coffee on the porch at dawn. But everything had a different texture. The silence in the house was no longer the companion I'd made it into, but an absence I couldn't stop noticing. Emma's question kept surfacing at the strangest moments. I'd be halfway through mending a fence post, hammer in hand, and I'd realize I'd been staring at nothing for 5 minutes, replaying the sound of her voice on that porch. I'd pour my morning coffee and reach for a second mug out of habit, the one I'd stopped setting out a year ago, and then stand there, holding it with the coffee pot in my other hand, feeling like a man who'd just stepped out of a dream he wasn't ready to leave. On the second day, I thought about calling Walt to ask for Emma's number. I picked up the phone, set it down, picked it up again, and then put it back on the counter and walked away like the phone was something dangerous. Beau watched me from the kitchen doorway, with his head tilted to the side, the way dogs look at you when they're trying to figure out what you're doing and whether they should be worried. On the third day, I did the same thing, and I'm not proud of how long it took me to work up the courage to do what I already knew I needed to do. On the 4th morning, I drove to the cemetery on the hill outside of town, something I hadn't done in 3 years. I parked under the same oak tree I always parked under and walked to Eleanor's grave with the sun coming up over the fields behind me. The stone was clean because Walt comes by once a month and makes sure of that, and the roses someone planted years ago were still blooming, small and stubborn and red against the gray. I stood there and I talked to her. Not a prayer, not a speech, just the kind of talking you do when you're alone with someone who knew you better than anyone. I told her about the dinner party and about Emma and about the question that had cracked me open. I told her about the guilt, how it felt like wanting connection again was a betrayal of what we had, and the fear that if I let myself feel something for someone new, it would mean I'd let go of her. I didn't hear an answer, and I don't expect to, but standing there in the morning light, with the grass wet under my boots and the birds waking up in the oak tree, something settled inside me. Not a voice, not a sign, just a quiet knowing that rose up from the same place Emma's question had reached. Eleanor didn't give up on me when she was alive. She pushed me and challenged me and made me better than I would have been alone. She wouldn't want me to give up on myself now that she was gone, and the grief wasn't a monument I had to maintain, but a bridge. Emma was standing on the other side of it, and the only thing keeping me from crossing was my own fear. I drove home with the windows down, and the air felt different, cleaner, like the world had been washed overnight, and I was only now noticing. I walked into the kitchen, picked up the phone, and called Walt. He answered on the second ring, and I said I needed Emma's number. Walt was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "About time, Henry," and I could hear the smile in his voice even through the phone. I called Emma that afternoon. She picked up on the third ring, and her voice was the same as it had been on the porch. quiet and steady and warm. I told her I thought I owed her an honest answer to her question, and there was a pause on the line. Not long, just a breath, and then she said, "I've been hoping you'd call." We met for coffee 2 days later at a small place on Main Street with wooden tables and windows that let in good light. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug, and when she looked up and saw me, she smiled in a way I hadn't seen at the dinner party. It was a real smile, unguarded, meant for me, and it made something in my chest shift like a lock turning. I sat down and I answered her question, really answered it, without the cardboard "I'm fine" I'd given her at the table. I told her the truth about how I was doing, that most days felt like walking through a house that used to be full and now echoed, that I'd stopped hoping and then stopped noticing I'd stopped. I told her that her question had made me realize the difference between surviving and living, and it took me 20 minutes, and it wasn't pretty, and my voice broke more than once. Emma listened to every word the way she'd listened on the porch, with that river patience that absorbs without resistance. And when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. Not a romantic gesture, not yet, but a human one, the kind of touch that says, "I'm here," without needing words. "That's the answer I was hoping for," she said. "Not because it's easy, but because it's true." And I looked at her hand in mine, small and warm, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years, like the day ahead of me mattered, like there was someone to tell about it. That evening, I sat on my porch with Bo at my feet and my phone on the railing. There was a message from Emma, just a few words, and I read it 3 times. Something in my chest that had been stuck for 3 years settled into place. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me which moment got you the most.